"Do not worry, sir," said the guide, his voice somehow audible even above the hellish din of the artillery. "You are quite safe as long as you stay by my side." I looked to the old lady for assurance as she seemed privy to whatever devilish trick the guide had pulled to bring us to this hellscape. "This man will lie to you about most things, but on this, he is telling the truth," she confirmed. I shook my head in dismay, my brain still unable to comprehend what was happening to me. I knew going in that this wasn't going to be easy and had fully expected to witness terrible things, but this was beyond my wildest imagination. I froze to the spot, suddenly realizing that the artillery bombardment had ended and an eerie silence had come over the battlefield. But of course, it didn't last. Then I heard the series of sharp whistles from the British trench line, and I watched on in horror as ladders were raised and helmeted Tommies emerged, striding out into the killing fields. "My God," I swore, and tears rolled down my cheeks as I watched the tragedy unfold. "And here they come, lambs to the slaughter," said the tour guide, a 6-smile across his face as he spoke. "Lions led by donkeys," the old lady added, a terrible sadness in her voice. The first wave of soldiers were barely out of the trenches before the machine gun fire began, a relentless barrage of bullets which cut human beings to shreds. Soldier after soldier fell, dropping dead or wounded in the mud and wire, their awful screams audible even above the heavy din of gunfire. But still they came, company after company of brave men throwing themselves into the breach, stepping over the bodies of their kinsmen as they pushed forward towards the German lines. We were literally standing in the middle of this living hell, watching as bodies fell all around us. But thanks to whatever black magic the guide had conjured, it appeared we were safe from harm. The soldiers on both sides weren't able to see us, and the bullets and shrapnel couldn't hurt us. There was death and devastation all around us, but it was like we were contained within some kind of protective bubble. But still, no man's land was a living hell, as young men continued to fall in a wanton slaughter, their fragile bodies torn apart by high-velocity bullets and their blood and guts littering the battlefield. One young soldier fell only feet away from where I stood, dropping his rifle as a bullet pierced his chest. He looked up as he fell, his young eyes full of pain and fear. I swear he made eye contact with me for a brief moment before he took his final breath and left the mortal plane. The old lady walked up beside me and spoke into my ear. Such a sad thing to see a young life snuffed out so violently. He died alone and scared, so far from his home. What was his name? Where was he from? What were his hopes and dreams? Each death is its own individual tragedy, and there are so many. Her words moved me, but they clearly angered the guide. "Bah, enough of this sentimental rubbish," he snarled. "War is war. And besides, the main event is still to come." I shot him a look, wondering what he meant, and all of a sudden everything stopped. The machine guns and artillery all ceased, and the advancing troops, those who were still alive, stopped in their tracks, simply standing still in the middle of no man's land. I felt concerned, wondering what the hell was happening. Had a ceasefire been called? No, that couldn't be right. It didn't match the history I'd learned. I had a terrible feeling deep in the pit of my stomach, knowing that something horrifying was about to occur. The ground beneath our feet shook and I almost fell down into the mud. I looked at my companions and noted the sharp contrast in their expressions. The old lady's face was filled with sorrow, a look of sad resignation. Meanwhile, the guide was almost giddy as he watched the chaos unfold. Violence and death on this scale. This carnage always presents an opportunity for our forces, but of course, you already know this, don't you, sir? He winked at me in a frightening fashion, and I knew right then that he was on to me. I opened my mouth to speak, but didn't get the chance to respond, as a moment later the two trench lines lit up in a fiery inferno. In a panic, I looked up into the morning sky and saw hundreds of fireballs descending, each the size of a car and each guided by an unseen force. They hit both the British and German lines simultaneously and with deadly precision, setting the trenches on fire and causing utter carnage. "Our initial attacks are infinitely more successful than the artillery strikes," announced the guide, delving deep underground and incinerating men inside their bunkers. "The mortals don't stand a chance." As if to emphasize his point, I heard the chilling cries of men being burnt alive, and my nostrils were filled with the foul stench of burning flesh. It was difficult to imagine a battle as brutal as the Somme becoming even more horrific, and yet this was what I was witnessing. I realized then that the demonic guide hadn't just transported me back in time, but also to another dimension, one where Hell's Legions had chosen 1916 as their year of invasion. The fiery orbs always came first. I knew this from reading the previous accounts. But this wasn't the end of the assault. I turned slowly, seeing movement out of the corner of my eye. Glancing downwards, I was horrified to witness the dead soldier suddenly twitch and then move, his body brought back to life by a dark force. His joints cracked as he clumsily stood, his eyes dead and his jaw hanging open. He looked like some kind of meat puppet, held up by invisible strings, and for a brief moment he, or rather it, stood still, seeming to stare straight at me. When it charged, I screamed, and my instincts told me to flee, but when I tried to run, the old lady grabbed my arm tightly, holding me back. I was surprised by how strong she was. "Don't," she ordered. "If you leave this circle, you will die." And she was right. The reanimated soldier ran right past us, instead sinking its teeth into another British Tommy, hungrily devouring a young man who may have been his friend only minutes before. I turned away in disgust from the gore, only to discover this gruesome scene was being replicated all across the battlefield, as thousands of British and German soldiers came back in a zombified state, launching savage attacks against the living. Former enemies became allies as they desperately fought back against the zombie hordes, firing rifles and machine guns and ultimately fighting back using bayonets and rifle butts. But it was futile, as every time a man fell dead, he would immediately come back on the enemy's side. Soon, all of No Man's Land was dominated by the zombie hordes, and they hunted down the survivors in a bloodthirsty frenzy, tearing men to pieces with their bare hands and feasting upon their still warm flesh. I was horrified, dropping to my knees and vomiting in the mud, my whole body shaking as I felt like I was going to pass out. The old woman placed a delicate hand on my shoulder and spoke soothing words in my ear. There, young man. What we are witnessing is pure evil, but you are strong and we can get through this together." The guide responded with cruel mockery, however, looking down upon me with utter contempt. "Oh dear sir, are you feeling poorly? All a bit too much for you, I suppose. Well, we're just about done at this location anyway. Time for a change of scenery. How about some sea air?" With that, he clicked his fingers for a second time, and I found myself transported to yet another time and place. I felt the sea breeze against my skin and sand beneath my feet. Looking across the sandy beach, I witnessed a heavily militarized coastline, with X-shaped tank traps and barbed wire, and with the cliffs above fortified with concrete bunkers and pillboxes. And then I looked out to sea, reacting with shock as I witnessed a vast armada of warships and landing craft cutting through the waves and rapidly approaching the shoreline. The date, June 6th, 1944. The guide stated, Omaha Beach, Normandy. After years of preparation, Allied forces launch Operation Overlord, the invasion of German-occupied France. The Allies enjoy a substantial superiority in the air and at sea, but the German coastal defenses are strong, and the first wave of infantry will be vulnerable. The supreme sacrifice those young men will make, the old lady added, traveling halfway across the world to fight against an evil regime, all in the name of liberty. We bear witness to heroics even in these dark times. They fight because they believe in something greater than themselves. The guide snarled at the woman, casting her a hateful look. The tension between the two was growing, and I feared how it would end. But there wasn't time to think about that now, as once again the chaos of battle took hold all around us. Shells flew over our heads, with Allied destroyers bombarding the shore fortifications and German 88 guns shooting back at them. Several of the landing craft were hit, exploding into fiery infernos, the GIs on board dying horribly before they even reached the beach. The next wave didn't fare much better. As soon as the craft reached the shore and the landing ramps came down, a heavy barrage of bullets from the German machine guns tore into the American soldiers, killing and wounding dozens in a matter of minutes. But still they came, advancing up the beach, using the metal obstacles for cover as they returned fire and slowly pushed towards the cliffs. Many men were dying before my very eyes, and it was a horrific sight, but I was also confused. I was thinking back to the student's account, the one who attended the lecture in an alternate, hellish realm. In that dimension, Hell's legions had invaded in late 1942, and so the D-Day landings had never taken place. So, what was this? What was the guide subjecting me to? Was I seeing the Normandy invasion in my own timeline, or was this the history of yet another alternate dimension? I soon got my answer. My heart froze as the ground shook and the battle suddenly paused. I knew what was coming next. My attention was drawn to the cliffside, as suddenly the German pillboxes were struck by deadly fireballs and exploded into flames. Some of the American GIs cried out in triumph, apparently believing that their side had done the damage. But sadly, they were mistaken. I turned towards the English Channel and witnessed the sea boiling, waves rising as something huge and horrifying emerged from the depths. I knew what it was, having read the previous accounts. But hearing the stories could never have prepared me for seeing the beast firsthand. As I stood in shocked awe, the guide walked up beside me, sporting a sadistic grin as he confirmed what I already knew. The Leviathan, terror of the seas. No man-made vessel can withstand its deadly grasp. As if to emphasize his point, the creature raised its enormous tentacles above the surface, wrapping them around the nearest Allied warship. I could only look on in horror as the beast used its immense size and strength to crush the steel hull. I heard a terrible screeching sound of crushed metal and of sailors crying out in absolute terror. The beast slowly pulled the destroyer downwards, condemning its crew to a watery grave. Its terrible task done, the beast moved on to its next target, attacking a second warship with impunity. The GIs on the beach had stopped fighting as all now looked back towards the sea, unable to comprehend the horror they were witnessing. Some of the landing craft had made landfall while others were still on the water. The landing was already in disarray, but Hell's forces had yet another devilish trick up their sleeves. I saw movement underneath the water's surface as yet unseen predators swam into position and prepared to attack. The first beast leapt up from the water, literally jumping into a waterborne landing craft and tearing into the men inside in a bloody massacre. It all happened so quickly that I hadn't gotten a good look at the monster, but hundreds more were coming, emerging from the depths to attack both the boats and the shoreline. The best way I can describe them is sea serpents, each at least 20 foot long and covered in thick, green scales, their eyes a hellish shade of red, and their hideous maws filled with dagger-like fangs. The beasts attacked with a predatory instinct, swimming the shallow waters and slithering along the sands. Soldiers screamed as they tried in vain to mount a defense, but the serpents leapt upon them, swallowing men whole in a horrifying massacre. I turned away, closing my eyes and covering my ears. Once again, the old lady came to my aid. Remember, young man, the so-called guide is a liar. You cannot trust what he shows you. I opened my eyes and raised my head, meeting her gaze as I shouted my angry reply. But this has happened. It is history. Maybe not in my world, but that doesn't make it any less real. The woman smiled thinly, shaking her head. The truth is not so simple, and there is always hope, she answered, pointing towards the cliff face. Look. I glanced over to the end of the beach, amazed to see German and American troops combining forces, forming a defensive cordon and shooting down serpents, killing several as they held the line against all the odds.